so the videos, they dealt with the finishing of the Hume discussion and the sort of the transition from Hume to Rawls, and then the rest of this unit will be looking at this sort of these are the two main, in some ways main outliers maybe, but also definitely the main, at least in Rawls's case, the main contender of the most recent developments on philosophical theories of justice. Rawls is, I said a little bit at the end of the video about this, but Rawls really is the towering figure of political philosophy since the mid-20th century. When we turn to Nozick, you'll see Nozick says, he wrote this fairly briefly after Rawls's book was published. He says, you know, people now either have to work within Rawls's framework or explain why they don't. And that's sort of, it's not quite true anymore because time has passed. But for decades it was definitely true. And for decades it was true that you couldn't explain why not, because if you didn't, then you were just sort of not considered to be part of the conversation. That's over. But he still, still has many, many followers, and even those who are not among his followers recognize what an enormous contribution he made. Nozick thinks very differently, of course. Nozick has a sort of a fairly extreme version of the Lockean theory of justice, which is very different from Rawls. And so that's what we're going to be looking at going forward. So today I want to go over Rawls's arguments and his theory, the main outline of which I've given you in the video before, so I'm going to have to go fast because there's a lot of ground to cover. I want to get through what sort of his basic intuition is behind the theory, and then I want to get through some steps in the argument, the more formal steps that you've read. And we'll take that in turn. Some of the formal steps I'll skip over, but the ones that are more technical we'll spend some time on. So, a lot of stuff to do. Here's the intuition, right? So, if you remember, Rawls thinks justice can be captured into two principles, three depending on how you count, because the second principle has two parts. But basically, first principle is everyone has maximal. Started with that maximal, like most extensive scheme. Later he walked that back because it was like, whoops, couldn't get everything he wanted if he went for maximal in the first principle. So then it became sort of adequate. But at least in the intuitive case is you begin with giving everyone maximum equal liberty. So everyone gets as much freedom to live their lives as they want to, consistent with the like freedom of all. Sort of the Kantian idea, if you can see sort of the shadow of that here. But he makes a distinction between those basic liberties on the one hand and then sort of the social and economic parts of life on the other. So if you think about it, you can think about a distinction on the one hand between freedoms in the political and social arena and freedoms in the economic arena, and they're split between these two principles. And so the first one says you get maximal amount of freedom in the political and social arena, and then there is a further question about the economic stuff. So think about the right to vote, think about freedom of religion, think about freedom of speech, things like that. That all goes in the first. Now the second then is, once we've settled that, right? Second principle thinks, well, social and economic inequalities, so just roughly think about, the simplest idea to think about is just think about it as wealth or income, although it's not quite correct for Rawls to summarize this as being about wealth and income. As a little heuristic that will work for now. So these are to be arranged so that they are both reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage. You can see the Humean idea, right? That society is supposed to be for mutual advantage. Everybody gains from living in society compared to not. And B, attached to positions and offices open for all. So basically, there can be inequalities, he thinks, as long as they benefit everybody and everyone in society has a chance to occupy a position anywhere within the distribution. Right? So you could, of course, have one without the other, but you need both, he thinks. So that's the intuitive case. That's roughly what justice is about. And the first principle is lexically prior to the second. I think I've asked you to think about that. Basically, the idea is there cannot be any trade-offs upwardly. Right? So you can't do anything. It might be possible to get more social and economic equality by trading off some basic political and social liberties, civil liberties. No, says Rawls, that won't work. Right? So absolutely zero trade-offs between the two. It might mean that you have to give up some social and economic equality in order to get the political and civil liberties, but the other way around, no, there's no trading. So think about, as an example, right, something like Singapore, right? So Singapore, very, very wealthy country, but you don't have the fully extensive political liberty because you don't have a lot of freedom of speech, they don't have full democratic rights and so on. You might think, well, that's a pretty good deal. No, says Rawls, not just, right? So, because that would be to gain something from here at the expense of there.
You can pay for more rights, but you can't have more rights than you can pay for. You can pay for more rights, like you're paying to get more rights, but you can't give up your rights to get paid more.
Yeah, yeah. Good phrase. All right, so that's the basic idea, right? So these two principles, maximal political and civil liberty, and then inequality only if it benefits everybody, and then no trade-offs, according to Cameron's principle there. Okay. So here's the intuition, as Rawls puts it, right? So the special case of a more general conception, namely all social values, liberty, opportunity, income, wealth, social basis of self-respect. That's sort of his list of, in the most general form, the things that matter for justice. They are to be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution of any or all of these values is to everyone's advantage. And so he says with the political and civil liberties, there is no advantage to be gained from it being unequal. Some people have more votes than others. That's not better for everybody. It's just better for some and worse for others. But with economic things, it's different, he thinks. Then some inequality actually can be to the benefit of all, and so that's why he separates the two. So and then he says, if we go separate the two, then the higher expectations of those who are better placed, better situations, are just if and only if they work as part of a scheme that improves expectations of the least advantaged members. So that's his idea of mutual advantage, right? That's this Humean idea that for a society to be just, we all have to gain. And he thinks, well, that only works if the benefits and the top end of the distribution actually help those on the bottom end of the distribution. So that's what he calls the difference principle, the distributional principle. And so here's the basic steps towards it, and we'll get to the more formal claim in a moment. But basically the idea is you start with an idea of, like a default idea of equality. You begin with thinking that everybody should be equal. And we have to justify deviations from that. Now, in the political civil, there are no justifications. In the economic, maybe there are. What might they be? Well, here's the basic intuition or the basic idea. Thought, the size of the pie, the economic pie, isn't fixed. Right? It's not just we come into the world and there's an X amount of goods out there and we can either divide it equally or unequally. And if we divide it unequally, that means some get more at the expense of others. We've seen already that Rawls thinks that's unjust. That people would prosper, or some people would have less so that others might prosper. That was unjust. We saw it last time. So he says the size of the pie responds, right? It's sensitive to how we slice it up. So if we slice it up in equal slices, then the pie is a certain size. If we slice it up unequally, the size of the pie gets bigger, or could get bigger. So think about it this way, right? You might have a pie like that we just slice into 4 pieces like this. There you go. Everyone has a quarter pie of this size. But if we decide to slice it up unequally, then maybe the pie becomes this big, right? So you might think something like that. Now, not everybody has the same size slice, but here's the great thing, Rawls thinks, everybody's slice is bigger. Even the smallest one here is bigger, right, than equal there.
So Rawls expressed more of a concern about absolute poverty, I guess, than he did relative.
Yeah, that's he thinks if we have to choose between sometimes, he thinks not always, but sometimes we can face a choice, right? Between doing something about people's absolute living standards or doing something about their relative living standards. And if we do face that choice, then we should choose absolute over relative. So, which is just another way of saying you start with equality, right? And the only way we deviate from equality, we let go of equality, is if everybody gains. And so that means he thinks that every slice here has to be bigger than the slices would be over there. And one way to test that is the smallest slice bigger than the equal slice, which is also the smallest size, but also the biggest size, right? Over there. And so if this small here is bigger than small equal, then that's a good idea. Assuming, of course, that we can get there without violating the first principle, right? Because no trade-offs. Okay. So that's the solution here. Make the smallest slice as big as possible. That's the only deviation from equality. So there's an interesting argument, right? He thinks that there's an argument that even from a very egalitarian perspective, even if you have a full-bodied concern for equality, you should still accept some inequality in your society. Right? And as we'll see when we get to the more formal argument, he thinks it will be irrational not to do that, unreasonable not to do that. And if so, then the strict equality person has a problem on their hands. Right? All right, I'm trying to keep the pace going, but am I going too fast? Is anything clear? Are we not unclear? Okay. Stop me if I go too fast. So, all right, that's the basic intuition, right? So let's go to the formal argument. So Rawls thinks, we've seen that before, right, that justice is roughly what rational bargainers under certain hypothetical conditions would choose in the original position. Right? So that's the basic idea of the theory, right? So how can I demonstrate that this is what justice requires and not that or some other version? And he says, well, let's think about what we would think is rational for us to accept under certain hypothetical conditions. That'll be justice, whatever we accept under those hypothetical conditions. And so if that's true, right, we need to know these three things, right? What are those conditions? Like what makes them so special? What are the options between which we get to choose under those conditions? Right? What's on the table? And then how do we choose between them? So those are going to be our steps. The first two are going to be, I'm just going to summarize very quickly. This third one is the one where you get more of the formal argument for Rawls. So what's the choice situation? Well, you know this, right? It's the original position. And you choose there behind the veil of ignorance. So here's the quote. We have to imagine that those who engage in social cooperation, so you and me, right? And this is people who live together. In one joint act, they choose the principles that are to assign the basic rights and duties and the division of social, that is justice, right? It's just this long-winded way of saying justice. So the choice that which rational men or women, this is just old-fashioned talk, I guess, would make in this hypothetical situation of equal liberty, assuming for the present that it has a solution, determines the principles of justice. So just restating, there is a hypothetical condition where we make this choice, whatever the choice is going to be, we call it justice. And so the choice is made from behind the veil of ignorance. That situation is the original position, and in this original position, we choose behind the veil of ignorance. We've seen this already, again, right? So among the essential features of this situation, being the original position, so no one knows his place in society, class, position, or social status, fortune in the distribution of natural assets, so small, large, strong, weak, smart, not so smart, creative, not so creative, right? Whatever, all these things that you might set one person apart from. You don't know where you are, right? Which person you are. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conception of the good. It just means like what you care about, like, you know, what type of life you would. Maybe you like sports a lot. Maybe you like the life of arts. Maybe you're a couch potato, right? Maybe you're an athletic, whatever. But you don't know that. So the principles of justice are chosen behind the veil of it. That's what he calls the veil of ignorance. All that is obscured by the veil. Now why, right? He says, why should we not have any information about that when we're choosing? Why should we choose principles without knowing what our particular characteristics and properties are? Well, because it ensures that no one is going to be advantaged or disadvantaged in the choice of principles by the outcomes of natural chance. And there are some things that are just sort of random. Your genes determine how tall you are, right? If you're really tall, then you might be able to dunk a basketball. You can do that reliably. You make a lot of money, right? So if you knew that you're a very tall, athletic person, you might choose some principles that say no salary cap in the NBA or something, right? Right? So it's a little specific, but I'm going to let's roll with it. No salary cap in the MBA. Well, why? Well, you say, well, I might a lot of money for me. And Rawls thinks that's not a good suggestion. It's not a good proposal for a principle of justice. Right? It's a good self-interested proposal, but not a principle of justice. Principle of justice has to be kind of impartial, right? And it has to be a little more than just, well, I get more this way. Of course, if it's good for everybody, right, that salaries for people like that would go up as big, well, then we're in this situation. That's a different argument, he thinks, right? And then you would choose it even if you didn't know whether you're going to be able to dunk a basketball or not. If you turned out, we chose some principles, right? Turns out dunkers make a lot of money, right? You're not a dunker, right? Like me, I can't jump for him. So can't jump. So I can't dunk a basketball. I can barely grab the rim. 6'2" is pretty pathetic. Sorry? You feel? Yeah. Well, you're not 6'2", right? Like I am. That's the problem. So, I guess I have short arms, but it's not any better. The idea of Rawls thinks it's reasonable for the principles to allow that, because even though I'm not the one who's making all the money, I know that by living in a society where people like that make a lot of money, I'm better off. Right? So it's like saying, well, I could have been here and had an equal slice to LeBron James. I don't, but it turns out that my slice, which is much smaller than his, is bigger than it would have been in that society. And so, I'm actually quite happy that we went with these principles and not those. So that's the thought. So the veil of ignorance ensures a kind of impartiality that justice must have. So you can see, right, so what Rawls is doing, he's molding together a choice situation where by virtue of what the grounds of the choice are, what informs the choice, the outcome of that choice is going to be just. And so that's a way of justifying, of showing, like demonstrating, motivating your principles of justice. Right? You say, well, here I have these principles. Why should you accept them? Well, because they're the kind of things that would be chosen under a situation, under conditions that we before accepted, like, well, things that are accepted here are impartial and fair. Right? And so that's a way of showing, well, these are the fair principles. So it's a very creative argument. All right. So far, so good? More quotes. You can read these by yourselves. It's a basic. There's some more detail here, but the one thing I'll say here to pay attention to is Rawls is very clear. The original position is not an actual place, right? It's a thought experiment. It's a way of thinking. And so given the way it's set up and all our particular features and facts are abstracted away, if we correctly do this reasoning, you and me, we should come all to the same conclusion, right? Because all the things that set you apart from me behind the veil of ignorance, and so all we have left is sort of the reasonable, rational stuff that we share. Now, of course, we might not actually come to a conclusion because I make a mistake, or maybe I'm unreasonable, or irrational, or just I'm not smart enough, or I'm biased or something, or can't quite get myself to give. Okay, well, that kind of disagreement doesn't count. If we were all reasoning correctly as justice would require, then we'd actually come up to the same thing. So it's not he often talks about rational bargainers, but there's actually no bargaining going on, right? Because all the bargainers who come to the table, everybody wants the same thing. And that's what the veil of ignorance ensures that. They want the same thing because all the grounds for wanting different things are obscured. Right? That's the idea. Strong Kantian overtones, right? Justice is sort of given by reason, by applying your reason in universal ways, like all the particularities about your own self, desires, and so on are all gone from justice, right? So you can see why Rawls presents this as a version of social contract theory. It's very Kantian in flavor. And so here's some more Kantianism, right? If society is governed by such principles, and I ask you to think about this, it is as if we are freely accepting it. So Rawls says, oh, no society can, of course, be a scheme of cooperation which we enter voluntarily, literally, right? But this is as good as that. Because it'd be the rational part of yourself would be committed to this because of the arguments we just seen. And so you could maybe object to it on unreasonable grounds. You could object to it because it doesn't give you more and you would like to be a slice even bit you'd like. So you might think, well, the world would even be better if, I didn't have this, but I had this big of a slice. I want to eat some of your part, you know. But that's not a fair, that's not a fair reason for wanting more, for being dissatisfied with this society. It's a selfish reason. Right? So you have more than me, and I want some of yours. It's not justice. That's egoism. So I'm here. I might be dissatisfied, but I have no good reasons for being dissatisfied. And so if I see that, then I can see that I really have no reasonable grounds to stand up to resist. And that's as good as, it's not quite literally voluntary, but it's the closest we can expect to come. Again, very Kantian, right? Be guided by reason is not a violation of your freedom. Even Locke would agree with that, by the way. If you remember, liberty is not license, and so on. All right. So far, so good? Something for you to chew on, by the way, but there's a question here. Like, Rawls just throws this out. He sometimes does this. Presents assumptions as if they're very, very mild and innocent, and they're actually not innocent. Right? This is not an innocent assumption. No society can, of course, be a scheme of cooperation, enter voluntarily in the little sense. Of course. Well, Locke didn't think so. Right? Locke spends the whole second treatise saying, no, there is a way in which voluntarily, better be voluntary, otherwise you're enslaved, and so on. Now, of course, Rawls thinks that Locke is completely misguided about this, but you should ask yourself if he's right. Rawls thinks that this kind of Lockean state of nature in which we truly voluntarily enter the state is just a myth. It's just a story. And even Locke himself didn't think so because he wasn't an anarchist, right? Maybe. But it matters, right? Because if truly voluntary is on the table, and Rawls wants to keep your original position stuff alive, then he has to tell us why this sort of semi-voluntary, or as good as voluntary, might trump, outperform, or at least be equally good as really voluntary. Right? And in most parts of life, we don't think that. We don't think, well, if you were rational, you would have bought my house for me at this price. Right? So therefore, hand over your money. That's not how it works. It is how it works for Rawls, by the way. But so, here's basically the argument I'm going to summarize briefly. So he thinks rules of justice are justifiable or acceptable to us as free and equal. That's the starting point of his theory, as for any social contract theory, that people are free and equal. We have to respect each other as such. Can't just boss each other around. So what type of rules would be justifiable to us given that we're free and equal? Well, the ones that are rational and fair, right? That's the Kantian idea. The original position ensures that we are choosing principles on rational grounds without knowing our position. That's just what it is. So that's simple. If we make a choice rationally without knowledge of your particular prospect, so behind the veil of ignorance, then that's sufficient for it to be rational and fair. Right? This is the idea that the original position ensures that the choice is made rationally and fair, and it ensures that by what it abstracts from view. We make our choices on rational grounds. We make it without knowledge of our particular position. We do know about sort of the general way in which societies work, and so on. All right. More quotes. Look at those at your leisure. And so then it follows, right, that the principles we choose in the original position are principles of justice. All right. So that was the first part. What's the choice situation like? Second part, very quickly, what are the options? Right? Now, so far we've talked about this first principle of justice as having to deal with political rights, civil liberties, and the second about like sort of money, income, wealth. That's not quite right for Rawls. He has a more technical way. He talks about primary goods. So it's not just stuff, right? Primary goods are a list of things or benefits that we all have reason to care about. And principles of justice set up in a society that distributes those things. So what the principles really choose is not who gets stuff, but what are the principles that then determine who gets stuff. And what's the stuff? What's his primary goods? And it's just really things that every rational person is presumed to want. Remember the original position, we only have sort of general information about rationality and social laws of nature and so on. So social science and laws of nature. And so, well, how can we decide what societies are better? Well, Rawls thinks, think about different institutions that we could choose, where those institutions govern who gets the things that we all have reason to want. And that will fit, right? Because we're looking for the things that we all have reason to accept in the original position. So here are some examples of what primary goods are. Your basic rights and liberties, so your right to freedom, your right to free speech, your right to freedom of religion, those things. Income and wealth, those things do matter. It's not the only stuff that matters, but it's stuff that really matters. Positions of power and responsibility, so he thinks about think of positions in politics and so on. They have to be, those are things that are going to be distributed by the laws and institutions of society. He also adds other things like the social basis of self-respect. That's a kind of a murky thing, but Rawls thinks that there are certain things that could be present in society, like social stigmas maybe, that would have certain people, that would predictably remove the grounds for people to have self-respect, and that would be a really bad thing. So we want to have a society in which not just everyone has the rights and liberties justly divided, not just money is justly divided, but also in which everyone can have self-respect. But those kind of things, sort of general good stuff, like things that we care about. Yeah, John?
Do you know if Rawls views basic rights and liberties as instrumental or non-instrumental? Because he also has it up there as primary goods along with income and wealth and positions of power and responsibility. How would he view the rest of those, like instrumental, non-instrumental?
What do you mean by, can you explain what you mean?
Does he view as basic rights as intrinsically valuable, or does he view them as like instrumentally valuable for justice, I guess?
It's a really hard question. Well, let's try this one. So he thinks that your basic rights and liberties are things that sort of drop out of your theory of justice. So what we do in the original position is we select principles, sort of general rules, and there were the two that we've seen before, right? And those rules define what rights and liberties you have. So it's not like in Locke where you just start sort of your rights to your person, freedom, and property sort of fall out of the air, like or given by God. They're just there, poof, right? And then justice is about how do we act within those rights. Right? So for Rawls, when we're in the original position, those rights are the things that we're choosing. So everything is on the table, and nothing's off the table because rights could do that. They could tell you, well, no, this is not up for negotiation because I have a right to it. No. Those are the things that we're choosing. Am I getting at what you're asking? Okay. Yeah, depending on how you think rights have to be before they count as instrumentally or intrinsically valuable, you could go either way, right? But they are derivative in a sense. So they're not the first building blocks. That is one of his main disagreements with Locke, by the way. He thinks that Locke assumed that the social contract gets drawn up by people with property rights already in hand, and he thinks that cannot be right. He has an argument for it, but he thinks that cannot be right.
So like that Hume thinks that justice is artificial?
Yeah, in a sense that's right. So in the original position, when we first come to think about this, there is no justice. Right? So sometimes people call his view constructivism, because you construct in the original position justice. And everything that's part of justice. Right? So that's property rights. Notice that it's also your free speech. Right? It's your rights over your own person. Right? Everything is gone in the original position. Now, he thinks the first thing that these bargainers will set up is rights over your own person. Right? So we all agree that we don't get to just use each other. Yeah, that's good for everybody. Right? He thinks that's very easy to get that through, but at least in the first instance, that's not a given. It has to be constructed too. Anyone else? Okay. So elsewhere in the book, in the passage I didn't ask you to read, because he actually lists things, like lists various theories and options. And those are theories. So think about utilitarianism as one of them. And you might think utilitarianism is a theory, right, that just says maximize the average happiness. Or in his case, maybe you might fold the primary goods into it. Maximize average primary goods. So that's a theory by which we distribute these things. Right? If we are in the original position, let's imagine we're in the original position, veil of ignorance, what theory would we choose? If it were utilitarianism, then it would be the case that we, in that position, would think the best choice we could have is just sort of to make sure that on average, everyone has as much of these primary goods as possible. So we choose that kind of a society that maximizes our expected primary goods. So, you just look at different ways that a society could work if we set it up in various ways. We add up all the utility, all the good stuff, primary goods in this case. We divide it by the number of people, and you just select the society that gives you the highest number. Right? That's one option. His theories, of course, are very different, right? So it precludes certain kinds of trade-off. In the utilitarian case, for example, Singapore might come out very nicely. You lose a couple of political and civil liberties, but you gain a lot of economic stuff. Put it on a pile, highest average might be Singapore. Right? But for Rawls, that wouldn't go. So, okay. So there's the steps, right? We go into this original position. What we select are principles, utilitarian principle or his own principles. What those principles select are institutions that then in turn distribute the primary goods, the stuff. Right? So there's quite a lot of steps in this sequence here, but that's sort of how he thinks about it. If we have societies at different institutions, we could set it up so that society looks like this, that the stuff, the primary goods are divided like this. Or we could do it like this. Well, we need some type of rule, right, to decide, decision rule, some grounds to choose, well, which one do we like? Utilitarianism would be one, right? We just say, well, that's the average size of slices here. Well, the average size here is as big as this slice because they're equally big. Right? But here the average is bigger. So actually utilitarianism would probably choose this society over that one. Now, of course, if the society was like this, right, let's say that we had it like this, but we also had an additional small slice. This is like a real small one, which is smaller than the smallest equal one. The utilitarian theory would still select this, because the average is still the biggest. Right? But Rawls's theory would not, right? So what we're selecting in the original position is a principle by which we can select between societies. Right? Or you might think the other way back, right? By thinking about which society you think would be a better way, you can learn which principle you find acceptable. If utilitarianism says this, right, and Rawls says that, let's suppose those are the only options, right? They're not, but let's suppose for a moment that they're the only options. You can learn something about what principles of justice you prefer by looking at which of these societies you would prefer to live in. Because if you're doing that, what society would I prefer to live in if I didn't know where in the pie I would fall? You're in the original position. That's it. And so the choice that you're making there is, maybe I like this one better than that one, because I'd be really screwed if I were there, and I don't want to be really screwed, so I'll go, overall it's not that great, but cover my downside risk here. Then that tells you something about, well, when you think about it in the original position way, Rawls's principles are superior to the utilitarian principles. Or you might disagree, right? You might think, well, I don't care so much about the downside risk here. Rawls thinks you should, but if you don't, right, then we have a disagreement about what would be chosen in the original. But anyway, that's the type of, so that is the original position, what we're doing here, right? That is just us using that thought experiment way of choosing between societies. So we have a principle that selects a society, Rawls's principle, select this society. This society has institutions that divide the stuff. Those are the sequences. All right, here's the argument we just had, right? Blah, 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 blah. Therefore, principles chosen in original position are principles of justice. And then we have the next step. Principles of justice, Rawls's or utilitarian or whatever. They determine a basic structure of society, is what he calls just institutions, laws, government, things like that. More, but which governs then in turn the distribution of primary goods. And so therefore it follows, right, that the principles we choose in the original position determine the basic structure, which determines the primary goods. It's just that sequence again that we talked about. All right. Any questions so far? Pressing the pedal to the metal, I know, but I'm going to slow up a little now. Okay. All right, so here comes the choice. Right? So how do we choose between this? So when we did it right now, we started with an intuition, then we started talking about the smallest slice, but of course, if we talk about the smallest slice, why don't we talk about the biggest slice, right? Well, why? Rawls thinks you have to use the tools of rational choice theory. Right? So remember, original position, we choose on rational grounds. So he thinks, well, actually, we've got quite a nicely developed set of tools, intellectual tools for this. It's called rational choice theory. It's like the stuff that game theory and the prisoner's dilemma and so on, right? Those are the tools that we're going to be using, formal choice theory. And he thinks, well, here's what that means. It means first, the bargainers will choose strongly protect individual liberty. That's that first principle, right? And then second, they accept inequalities only to the extent that it benefits them all. That's the outcome. That's where we're going, right? So just quickly the argument again. He thinks, well, look, in this original position, all the bargainers have the same position. Nobody has natural authority. We're free and equal beings, so everyone has one vote. So we have to come up with an agreement between us. Well, then, if we're all equally situated, everyone has one vote, then we start with saying, well, let's just have everyone have an equal slice, right? Because think about it, all of us in the original position. I say, I have an idea, we slice it up so, but everyone has an equal slice except I get the bigger one. Or you're laughing at me, haha, no, wait. Right? The only thing that we probably can accept is equality, unless it turns out that something like this is on the table, right? Unless we could show, actually, we all get more if we don't go equal. So, quote, look at that on your own leisure. But he thinks allowing economic inequality, although not political and social inequality, is to the advantage of all. So we all stand to gain. And so if economic inequalities are rationally acceptable to all, they must be acceptable to the one who loses out because of the inequality, which is the smallest slice. And so that's a way of figuring out, are the inequalities to the advantage of all, is by looking at the smallest slice. And so they must maximize, he thinks, the benefits of the worst off. The way you figure this out is you make, if there's different pies, we'll get to some numbers in a moment, if there are different pies with different types of slices, the one that you select is the one where the smallest slice is the biggest. I'll note quickly, the step from 2 to 3 is not obviously correct. Right? It's not obvious, well, Nozick will hammer him on this, but it's not obviously true that inequality is to the advantage of all if and only if the smallest slice is the biggest. It could possibly be. But we'll get back to that next week. Right. So if all that's right, then it follows that the rational bargainers will insist on principles that offer maximal equal liberty. First principle. And inequalities that maximize the situation of the least well off. The smallest slice is the biggest. That's the difference principle, famously. All right. So we're going to follow the argument through, right? Maximal equal liberty, economic inequalities maximize situation of the worst off. His principles are chosen. This is how the whole argument goes. That's the overview. We'll look at the selection, the principle selection now in some detail, but just before we get there, this is the overview of what's going on in those pages. All right. I'm going to hit the brakes now. How do we choose societies, right? So I drew some pies here. Forget about those. Let's look at the numbers here. Let's think of just 3 groups. Another detail is people don't really select for themselves. They select for the group that they represent. Think about just sort of classes. So think about like lower classes, middle classes, upper classes. Right? So there's all these societies, A, B, C, D, 4 different possible societies with 3 different groups, upper class, middle class, lower class. And these numbers, I know, it has to be primary goods and blah, blah, blah. Just think about it as money for now. Right? Any dyed-in-the-wool will say, oh, no, it has to be primary. Just think about money. You're very antsy about that. So, one society. That's the simple equal division one, right? Everyone has the same, not that much money. Right? Second society, actually pretty unequal. Top has 110, very good. Middle class 60, better than 35, a lot better, but almost half, a little more than half. And then 40, 90, 55, 45, and then here 110, 55, 45. Or something. Which one would you choose? Sorry? D? Right D?
You got the highest of the lowest numbers, and it's still got the highest of the highest numbers. So, like, let's say you are in group 3, you're still better off than any other one, except for C, you're really equal. But if you're in group 1, you'll be better off in D than you would be in C.
Some people would pick C, you say? Why would they pick C?
Because it's more equal distribution, even with the lowest low being still the same level as D. You don't have the gross inequity, I guess. Some people would feel this inequitable.
Right. Which one do you think Rawls would choose?
Probably C.
Sorry? D? Why did you say C? Oh, well, hold on. You just said something. Will, why did you say D? We'll start there, and then we'll get back to you.
So you was talking about earlier the instrumental rationality. You know how we prefer more and try not to have less.
Right.
So if the lowest class is still going to have 45 either way, it doesn't make them any worse off that the upper class now has more. They still have the same slice.
Right, good. And they might not know where they end up, right?
Yeah.
So you would be, since we're choosing a society, unknowing whether, you might be rich, you might be poor, you might be in between. You might think, well, the rational thing for you to do would be D because just as good, but maybe I'm at the top.
Yeah.
That would be better. So D beats C is the thought, right?
Seems like we also need to take into consideration the net sum of all value, perhaps.
What do you mean?
Like the first one, when you add them up, you get
Oh yeah, that's fine.
105, and then it's 210 and 190 and 210. So I think that, I'm not exactly sure what that plays in part of it, but I know that more value is good. So we should probably try to maximize that at the very least.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. What do you think the utilitarian would choose? Because in a way, the utilitarian tries to maximize value, right?
Yeah, and I don't think that's what Rawls is trying to do. That's what
So not A, right? Yeah. Yeah, he's definitely different from Rawls. Right?
It's
it's C.
So here are how I think it is. So very simply, right? So if you go in for strict equality, then you go for A, right? Because you think inequality stinks, can't accept it. If the only way I can get equality, let's assume for the moment these are the only options, right? That's not obvious, but assume for if these are the only options and you believe in equality, right? A. Screw more money. Equality matters, right? Some people believe this. Not many, but some people believe this. Or at least you might think A is more just than B, C, and D. So there might be overall good reasons for wanting to live in a society like B or over A, but it's not because of justice, it's because injustice feels good or something. It's warmer injustice, it's more comfortable.
So Rawls would go with C because the smallest slice in C is still the biggest slice.
Good. So let me. I'll go over it quickly. So utilitarianism, Tyler was right about we'll just maximize the average utility, right? Not necessarily overall. Although if the numbers of people are right, then that's the same thing. But this is 170, it's 210, right? So average 70, utility of 70. And that's as big as we can get it. because this is an average utility. Here the total is 200 divided by 3 is 67.777. So the utilitarian says, no, we got to go B, right? Because the average per person is much higher. And you might think the utilitarian says, well, it's rational to do this because how do we know, if we don't know where we are, well, how do we choose? Well, you say, well, there's a 33% chance I'm here, 33% chance I'm there, 33%. Right? So add it up, divided by 3, that my highest expected value is 70. That's where I need to go. Some utilitarians told Rawls after he published his book, saying, you got this wrong. It's not this, it's this. Because the way to do this rationally is just you maximize expected value, which is total value divided by number of people. There's your expected value. We'll get to that in a moment. But so the utilitarian, in any case, thinks this. Rawls thinks this. So this is your point, Malik, right? Yeah. So remember how it goes, right? He says we start with the presumption of equality. And we allow deviations from the norm of equality only to the extent that it increases the largest, increases the smallest slice of the pie. Here we're increasing, but we're not increasing the smallest slice. Right. And so that's no good for Rawls, because this is just more inequality. And inequality per se is a bad thing. We only accept this if it's in the interest of all, and he thinks it's not in the interest of all here. The move from B to C is in the interest of all because, well, the interest of all for him means being in the interest of the poorest. But here from C to D, the poorest are no better off, and so it's irrational to accept this, he thinks. This is why I said at the previous slides, to go from the claim that justice has to be the advantage of all to the claim that justice is whatever is best for the poorest is not obvious that that's the same thing. Right? That's a question. It's an open question. Tyler, and I'll get to Will.
Why, if the expected utility for B and D are the same, then why would you pick B over?
Oh, they're not the same.
Unless I'm doing the math.
So I think this is 210 divided by 3 is 70. So this would be 200 divided by... Am I not right? Oh, it's 210. Okay, sorry, I messed that up.
That's what I was confused, because I mean, yes, this B, you have the highest outcome for group 3, and you have the highest.
Right. We'll make this 100. Doesn't really matter. As long as there is a gain at the top relative to... So you're right. Sorry, I messed that up. So yeah. As the numbers are here, the utilitarian would choose B or D, and the utilitarian has no way of choosing between those two, because average is all that matters, at least in the classical version. Yeah, good catch. Thanks. This is why I didn't choose math coming out of school. Yeah, Will.
So, but under the veil of ignorance, wouldn't you pick D because you wouldn't be any worse off? Like your options aren't actually any worse. You just improve your chances of being in the higher class and having more, but you don't actually get any less for being in the upper two. So in the veil of ignorance, wouldn't the rational person pick? Yeah, so let's see. So where am I? So here, right? So the idea is... As for Rawls. Oh, okay.
Well, it just has to... Yeah, well, the question is whether... It's a very good question, because you're asking, hey, Rawls is telling us, my principles are the rational ones. Right? And it matters, because the rational stuff is the acceptable stuff. Right? So only if his principles are rational are his principles acceptable.
Yeah.
Right? And so you're saying, well, actually, the rational thing would be to go for D, decided D and not C, and C is his version, and D is a different version. So this is why, again, right? So I said, look, Rawls thinks allowing inequality has to be to the advantage of all, and he thinks what that means is maximize the smallest slice. Right? And you're saying, well, actually, if we're doing this reasoning under in the original position, which is supposed to model what it is that is to the advantage of all, because we're choosing without knowing who we are, then actually we choose not to maximize the smallest slice and then stop inequality. We just choose to maximize maybe the smaller slice, and then if there are further benefits, we choose those too, because hey, we might end up being up there.
But isn't also part of this principle, or the first one I think, is for everyone to have sorry, voice correct, that's terrible. For everyone to also have as extensive rights as possible without, like those rights that can infringe on other people's rights. So wouldn't that be a more extensive rights, and it's not taking any more away than it would for C, because they still remain the same.
Yeah, it's a good point. for now, we're thinking about this as just the second principle, right? The difference principle. So we're assuming already that all of these societies have maximal political and civil liberties. So everyone is democratic, everyone has free speech, everyone has free religion, things like that. Now the question is, what kind of economic system do we introduce into that society? And then the way Rawls thinks we can think about this fruitfully is we can think about different types of systems. Which is the best? Well, let's think about the kind of distributions those systems bring about. And so we select the distribution we like best, and then we select the principle that gives us that distribution, and then that's the right principle to choose. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is Rawls thinks this is the right way to go, but it's questionable, right? It's questionable whether rational beings would actually do that. It depends on how much you really care about equality. The way that Rawls sets it up seems to make some sense. You start with inequality and you only deviate to the point that it's rational for the least well-off. But the question is, why only look at the least well-off? That's a point that Nozick makes too.
And I think Rawls would only go with D if 2 was 60 and 3 was 50. But if 1 was still 110.
Well, 2 doesn't matter, right? Like
Right.
2, as long as 3 is,
Okay.
yeah.
If 3 was 50, then it would be all right, or 55.
Right.
Even.
And it would be even all right if 1 became 70 or something. You could have a pretty massive loss on the top, as long as there's a small incremental gain at the bottom, right? And that's the egalitarian in him. He thinks justice requires that we tend towards this as much as is rationally acceptable, right? And he thinks, well, fully going here is not rationally acceptable because we could all benefit from deviating, but you only move away as far as you absolutely have to on the bottom side.
He wants the sentences.
Sorry?
He wants the sentences of like economic inequality, just so people get advanced, because going towards 2 egalitarian will sort of stymie you
Yeah.
to where A is.
Yeah, it can be, he thinks, he accepts this, it's it's true also, that unchecked insistence on equality can be costly to everybody, right? At least in the economic realm. So he thinks very different for political, like unequal votes or unequal civil liberties and stuff. That makes no sense because there is no gain for everybody from having an unequal division. These are really zero-sum, right? There's just gaining for some means less. Like some people have more political influence just means other people have less political influence, right? But some people having more stuff doesn't mean other people have less stuff. It could mean other people also have more stuff, just not as much much more than the other people have more. And so he thinks that's a very important fact, and that should inform your thinking of justice. Dominic?
So Rawls would still choose D if group 1 lost 40 points and got 70, and if group 3 gained only 5 points over 50, he'd still say that's the rational thing to choose.
Yeah. Notice that if group 1 lost 40 points and went to 70, and group 3 didn't gain a single thing, he would still choose D, because it would be more equal at no cost to the least well-off.
And then how is the least well-off, how can they be more valuable than the most well-off losing so much? It's like if the most well-off loses 40, and the least well-off doesn't gain anything, they don't lose anything.
Right.
How is that still better than somebody losing what they had?
Yeah. So.
Is it because it's closer to being equal?
Yeah, that's the answer. For Rawls, that's going to be the answer. Because he think about it as going through the bargaining in the original position, right? So you and I are bargaining. I have a proposal, fully equal. And you say, yeah, sounds good. Like, why do you say that? I say, well, because we both have equal amount of votes in the original position, right? Like 1 vote, 1 vote. So you get half, I get half. And then you tell me, well, actually, I've studied my economics. Turns out if we go for something that's not half and half, but 60-40, 70-30, I don't know exactly, right? We'll have to look at the charts, but something, then actually we'll both have more. And say, oh, okay, well, I'm instrumentally rational, right? As Will said, I prefer more to less. So actually, that's a good reason. Okay, let's go unequal. And then the question is, well, how unequal, right? And Rawls thinks, if you're going to end up with more than me, I'm going to allow inequality only to the extent that it benefits me. Right, so you might say, well, I can give you a 40-60. I say, that's a good deal. I said, well, here's another option, 40/70. And I'm thinking, well, why would I accept that?
Why wouldn't you? Because they keep giving you nothing. What's the difference? I don't understand. Like, to me, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem in Rawls's theory, right? So, here's another reason why I might accept it, because I could be you, right? Like we don't know who is who, so it seems to me that there is a perfectly good reason. So this is called Pareto efficiency. It just means like you move from here to here is Pareto efficiency, an economics term. Basically means you can improve people without making anyone worse off, and so that's a conception of efficiency that economists use. This is inefficient because there are things left to be used. They're just lying around. There's 20 stuff lying around, right? So it's inefficient. Efficient way would be to use everything. Rawls says that his theory is consistent with Pareto efficiency, but that's actually be playing fast and loose there. We can get into it, but I don't know. I think there's a slide here on. I may have deleted it, I may not, but anyway. It's only because it defines already as unjust inequalities that don't work towards the benefit of the least well off. And then he says, within those constraints, we apply the efficiency rules. And then, so yeah, well, thank you very much. Then it's by definition, right? But so you can see here, they're not the same. Just it can't be because I've got these options here.
So it seems like, I don't know, I understand that it takes into account that if we were equal, we would all have the same, but if we were unequal, we would still be unequal, but you would have more.
Everyone would have more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to really take into account the kind of social factors of even if I have more than if we were equal, you still have more than me.
Mm-hmm.
That I feel like it doesn't take into account the competitiveness and the kind of self.
Yeah, great point.
The word for itself.
Yeah, so if there were more time, the eternal caveat, but, Rawls's theory of justice actually, even though he presents it as this two-principle theory, it's actually not just a two-principle theory, because as the book goes on, he starts tagging on many more things. So one thing he tags on is what he calls a principle of fair value of political liberty. So the basic idea is something like what you're suggesting, I think. He thinks, well, it might be that we move from here to here. It's in our interest when we look at stuff, right? But remember, this cannot come at the expense of political freedoms or civil liberties. And maybe inequality of stuff can start seeping over into that, right? So maybe people start buying political power and so on. And so what we need is this additional principle that is the fair, like your political freedoms must have a fair value, which is sort of roughly equal value. And so that puts a dampener, further dampener on. So that's why when we are choosing rationally, he thinks, we wouldn't choose to just go for full-blown efficiency here. So what do we have to lose? Well, we might have to lose some political freedoms, he thinks. So that's putting the brake on it. But that stuff comes later. In the initial presentation, he thinks it just follows from the correct choice procedure of rational beings. And that's, I'm trying to point out, is actually questionable whether that's true. But yeah, those things are the great points. Rawls thought, especially the older he got, the more he started, this stuff started receding into the background throughout his life, and those worries that you're raising about how relative holdings might really affect things that you care about, and that money, the absolute amount of money might not be all that you care about. That stuff became more important to him. And his followers, I think, will think that stuff is really important. So if you're looking for the left-winger in Rawls, then that's where you should be looking more than here. Although this is kind of the most famous part, I think. Malik, did you have your hand up a second ago? No? Okay. You, Cameron?
It was me, but I was just going to say, then you could also get to, if he wants to come at it from the angle he's coming at, which is probably going to be more left-wing, is it really income inequality that's the problem, or wealth inequality that's the problem? At least with him, because then you get to income inequality that's more so people who have a certain entitled job that pays them because society says this job is very valuable, like a doctor or a lawyer.
Right,
you need
right.
doctors, you need lawyers. So there's going to be some income equality service and incentive for people to want to drive to do certain things. And so there is going to be a gap as far as income is concerned. That's
Right.
what things that you've earned. Wealth inequality, that's, well, my mom and my dad and my grandfather had this in the family, so I still have that in the family. So that's things that are unheard. Which one's the bigger problem? And that would be a question that Rawls' principles would have to answer.
Yeah, and so he said, I mean, he gives an incentive argument for why unequal shares would increase the share of everybody, right? So he says people will work harder and they'll do the unpleasant jobs only if there's payoffs for them. And we're all better off when people work harder and do unpleasant jobs. Right? So that's why letting go of equality can be to the benefit of all. But he also thinks it's not just income that is, I mean, these numbers, just for the ease of discussion, we're looking at them as just dollars of income, right? But they really represent the value of these primary goods, right? Which is this broad spectrum of things that we all have reason to care about. And so remember, that's basic rights and liberties. It is income and wealth, but it's also the access to these social positions, political positions. It's the basis of self-respect. So that might, people on the left often worry that inequality can undercut the self-respect of the poor. So they see themselves as sort of the losers in society, and that's a problem. So, all these claims, these are things that you have to prove, right? You can't just say that, but maybe that's true, and then that will be a reason for Rawls to reduce inequality. If it starts feeding into political inequality, massive problem for Rawls. You couldn't do that, right? Because there's no trade-offs. Again, you have to show that, right? But that's the kind of the structure of doing it. All right. Okay, quickly. Why would we choose to make? There's at least we're going down the line, right, of deeper into Rawls's theory and Rawls's followers and stuff. When Rawls presents the difference principle in what you've read, he gives you a different type of argument. It's not this bleeding over stuff. He says, no, it's actually the rational thing is to just focus on the smallest slice. Why? Well, he says it's a max-min rule. Bizarrely, he calls it max-min and everybody else calls it mini-max. Do you know why that is?
I was going to ask you about that, what the difference between mini-max and max-min is, if it's the same.
I think it's the same, but then there are sort of dark crevices of rational choice theory that I'm not completely sure at home in. But Nozick, for example, calls it mini-max when he refers to what Rawls calls maxi-min. So keep that in mind when you read Nozick. And others like Gaudier, who's another person who wrote in the 80s a famous book on social contract theory. He also calls mini-max trying to make sure that your least favorable outcome is as best as it can be. Yeah, and so, I mean, the idea is here that you maximize your minimum outcome. So I've always thought this made sense, right? But others flip it around. So like it's the minimum outcome that you maximize. I mean, you could say that too. But
minimize the maximal badness of your bad outcome.
Right, yeah. mini max bad or something. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, what can I do? Yeah. So anyway. So here's what Rawls says, right? The maxi-min, mini-max rule tells us to rank alternatives by their worst possible outcomes. We are to adopt the alternative, the worst outcome of which is superior to the worst common. So just make sure that your smallest possible slice is as big as it can be. Don't look at anything else. And he says this is the rational thing to do, right? Instrumental rationality is preferring more to less, roughly, but actually so roughly that it's not that, right? It's not preferring to more, it's only preferring more to less in the worst possible outcome. Right? And so as we saw with those numbers, the number game in the previous slides, preferring more to less and preferring like maxi-min they're not the same, they can lead to different societies, right? Preferring more to less led us to D, preferring maxi-min led us to C. All right, so he says, here's 3 reasons why. He says, well, you don't know the probabilities of the different outcomes. So 1, 2, 3, whichever class you're going to be, you have no idea of what the chances are that you end up there because you don't know who you're going to be. And he says, we don't care so much about how well we do overall as we do care about the minimum that we guarantee. He thinks you really care about the bottom, like your worst possible outcomes. And that is because he thinks these downside risks are grave. So those are the 3 reasons. So, quick question. We have 5 minutes left. Do you think this is a good reason for accepting that rule instead of just preferring more to less?
I think B's question was the first one.
Right.
Care about how much we have overall destruct and minimum guaranteed. I think that could be put in question if you're looking at, let's say, the up shots, $1 million, the down shots 10,
Right.
or the up shots 100 and the down shots 40. Like, what are you going to take? Some people would definitely take the upside of the million.
Right.
And so I don't think that's necessarily good, but anyway, how you say the maximum is better.
Yeah, so he's saying, like, if you're going to be in the original position, like when we were choosing between these things, the choice, the main thing for you is going to be you're super risk averse. Right? Like, you don't want to take that type of chance of losing 30 on the bottom potentially to go from 100 to 1 million, even though the upside swing is huge and the downside swing is relatively small. You can make it different, right? You might think, well, 40 to 10, and it's like 10 is only a quarter of 40, so that's pretty big relative terms, right? Well, I think you go from 40 to 38 and from 100 to 1 million, right? Now maybe it sounds even more tempting to take. No. You're so risk averse that you only look at the bottoms. So.
And then there's a lot of science to back that up. They've done a lot of studies to show that people are very, very, very risk averse.
Mm-hmm. Tyler?
I was going to ask about A, but I think I understand now. It didn't.
Oh, well, it's a good question. I actually think you can ask questions about each of these, so we'll get to that. But yeah, ask a question.
It doesn't really seem to make sense why the probabilities wouldn't matter. Other than like the initial thing of saying we're behind the veil of ignorance, so it shouldn't matter. But I mean, I guess it doesn't really seem to be based on anything other than like the idea that I don't know. I'm just not sure. It just seems weird to me.
Well, so there's an important question here, right? So he says you don't have any information about what the likelihood is that you're going to end up somewhere. But he also says in the original position you have access to basic social science, political science, economics, and all those things, right? You just don't know where you are. Sorry?
So like demographic information.
Presumably, right? We have to know things like, are we living in large anonymous societies or really small communities in which we know everyone by name? Possibly that the principles that apply to one are not the principles that apply to the other. Kinds of trust that you would have in that small knit society are not kinds of trust you can rely on in a society like ours.
Yeah, that also brings up a question for me for B. Like, it says we don't care about over the minimum guarantee. That's kind of like, what if there's a cap at that minimum? We can't go beyond that. Like,
right.
It seems like that would play because it falls into that demographic thing. It's something we should know. Like, if you're in a dictatorship and like they're going to keep everything to themselves, we know in that society that's how it works. At the bottom states that they are, the middle class states where they are, the top are the only ones that can move anywhere. It seems like would play into that.
Yeah, so he would, let's see, he would not accept a dictatorship, right? Because that would violate the first principle of maximal equal political freedom and so on. So you'd have to be, we're already in a democracy, right? But yeah, sure, there is a question about why we only focus on the lower end so much, especially if we don't know, right? But if social science and economics tells us that there are massive gains elsewhere in the distribution, in the demographics to be had, without any cost at the bottom, but also without any gains at the bottom. It's not clear why you would resist this, unless there are the other reasons that Michaela was bringing up, right? Like that there's actually, when we look a little further down the line, there are all sorts of other costs where there's sort of, you get these feedback loops that start feeding into political freedom or start feeding into other types of inequalities and so on.
Well, I guess, so like, I feel like one argument that, maybe I just read over it and he did make this argument and I missed it, but I feel like one really good argument for why you should use the min-max rule is that by paying attention only to like the worst outcome and trying to maintain equality, you can avoid a problem that would happen if you looked at more than just the worst off. Because like in the last example, the group 3 still had 45 in both C and D, but for D, that 45 is actually less than 45 because like comparatively, someone else has more than you. So like if we're talking about money, the reason why the dollar goes up is because now more people make more money, and now the dollar is worth less because there's more money out there. So the same thing would happen. So that 45 is actually worth less because there's more points or more money out there.
Right.
So it actually makes the...
Yeah, good. So that's true. It
Yeah.
could be, right, that your purchasing power of the same nominal amount
Yeah, and
is
so if
is
you
different given the
look at
different
anything other
conditions.
than the last option, then you'll be like, oh, then definitely D. But by helping group 1, you're hurting group
Right.
3.
Yeah, although we can set up the example slightly differently, right? We say, well, these are just goods, the primary goods. So it's not just dollars, but it's what a dollar will buy. And so you could compare two societies in which what a dollar will buy for the poorest is the same. Except, so there may be, it's true that the poorest need to have more in one society than in the other to have the same type of purchasing power, but we could compare those two societies then. Right? All right, real quickly. So some reasons to, at least to question this, right? So one is the one we just talked about, the demographics, right? You might know that the lowest class is really small and the middle class is really big, for example, and the top class is small. Then you know odds are that you're in the middle, right? And so you might start focusing more on the middle instead of on the bottom. Maybe in some societies the bottom is really, really big, and then it makes sense, right? But this is an open, it's a question whether this is the rational thing to do, given what we know in the original position. Now, if we don't know, this is the point that you brought up, Dominic, right? Like, it's not clear why we should only care about the bottom if we don't know where we end up in the first place. It seems we should care about all places. And here's the third, like he says the downside risk of being in the bottom is really bad, right? But the question is, I'm not sure why that's true. Like, if we can have a situation, it's different from the one Michaela sketched, right? Where economic inequalities do not feed into political inequalities. But we're protected in our political and civil rights. And the inequalities we're talking about really only are income and wealth. It's not quite sure, like, how bad of a downside is that to be on the bottom, right? To just have less than others. It seems that there's you're protected against a whole lot of the badness of being poor by having the first principle in place already. So anyway, Rawls thinks different, obviously. I'm just sketching these to raise some questions about his argument there. If you don't buy this part of the argument, then you might have to go to these sort of more complicated arguments about how economic and political equalities and inequalities might be related. It's an important question. Okay, let me see. So this is the stuff about Pareto improvements. Forget about it. Here is the one thing that is I want to flag. A further question. Well, this is one of the other assumptions that he says, well, let's begin to fix IDs, right? As if society is a closed system. No one enters, no one leaves. Right? And then those people we put around the table in the original position to bargain about the principles of justice. Closed system, isolated from other societies, right? He says, well, you know, if you move on, he says, the significance is obvious, needs no explanation. He says, wait, what? It seems not obvious because we've only the worst ever societies in history have tried to do this, right? And by the way, for bargainers, it makes an enormous difference because it takes, if you're going to be bargaining with others, the idea that if under certain rules people on the top might leave to another society matters tremendously for the bargaining situation. The fact that under certain rules people might want to come instead of leave makes a difference to the bargaining situation. The idea that having people enter and exit is an option, right, makes just a difference in terms of, here's one possibility, right? You might have some of the people in the original position say, let's split this society into two. Right? We'll do some people with that type of character will go on that side, some people with other character. That's a possibility that taking it off the table makes a big difference. Not saying that that's the right way to go, I'm just saying that he builds in an assumption here that affects the outcomes. And he presents it as it makes no difference. So, all right, hold on here. Just as a question, like what kind of liberal, he presents himself as a liberal. What kind of liberal thinks about society as closed instead of open? It's a weird thing for me. You might think the same principles of justice apply across the world. So all the societies will be identical. So there is no reason to leave from one to the other. Really enough, Rawls did not think that. I don't think that. So if you think so, then that's an answer. But all right. Got a lot of ground covered. Thanks for coming. Thanks for hanging in there. We're back on track. See you next time.